Hey all, hey Laughing Out. I just watched the video by the Laughing Out on why he wouldn't call himself a feminist, and I think broadly we agree on everything, and I think basically feminism is something that we should get beyond. Like, we should get beyond any movements that fight in particular for only one sliver of the population. But I myself think that feminism still has a place, a role in today's society, and it's still useful to keep the term around, at least until we've kind of transitioned into where it's no longer useful. And to start off with, I think it's definitely a good point to make that there's a lot of feminists who are not being productive. They're being counterproductive. They're themselves bigots. And by being bigots, they hurt their own cause. And that's very problematic. And I think that in itself is a good reason to really want to transition away from the term. And I myself am conflicted about it for that reason, and I definitely prefer labeling myself a gender equality or general equality person, a humanist, rather than a feminist. But I think there are still some reasons for calling oneself a feminist that I find are compelling. Now, in the video, the Laughing Out talks about the fact that both men and women are stereotyped, and these stereotypes force us into certain roles, and if we violate those stereotypes, we get sanctioned by society, whether it be directly through actual discrimination in terms of pay or job opportunity, or in terms of just social discrimination, people not regarding us well or making fun of us. And that's very true, and that happens to both men and women, depending on if a man wants to get a job that's generally considered a job that a woman would do, and if a woman does a job that a generally considered a man would do. But I think when it comes to the kind of jobs that nowadays are accepted as jobs that are in fact open to both men and women, like office jobs, the fact that women still get paid less in the same workplace, so when there's not really any specific stereotype at play, women are generally put at a disadvantage when it comes to positions of power, whether it be power in terms of political power or economic power. I think there's still a bias against women. So I think there's still a case for promoting women's rights in general, because I think in the end society is driven by power and power structures, and I think in power and power structures women are still disadvantaged. And obviously that's an argument you can have and might make a counter case to that, and I'm willing to have that argument, but I think that's generally true. And I think that is an area where really, because power influences everything else, rights in all other areas, that's something where we need to really promote women's rights. And in that regard, I think it makes sense to give that a specific label, much like the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, fights for civil rights, but it fights for civil rights specifically of one oppressed group, which is African Americans. I think there's room in this gender binary to say that one is struggling to achieve equality and the scales are still tipped against women. That's one sense in which the term is still useful. Although I will gladly say that there's definitely some areas like parenting rights where I think there's certainly many cases of men being treated unjustly. And in those areas, perhaps it makes sense to start talking about men's rights activists. And I think ultimately both of these groups should unite under the banner of an equal rights movement. But you could still talk about men's rights activism and women's rights activism. But then, and whether you want to call that feminism or women's rights activism or whatever, you could, people could identify as being an equal rights activist, but one day they'll go to men's rights march and one day they'll go to women's rights march, because there are separate issues in both camps that need to be addressed. The other thing is, I think globally there's a huge need for feminism, just because in a lot of countries that are not the first world, women are really treated very badly. And yes, men are also all the worse off for this kind of role they play, this supposedly superior role. I think it damages men and women. But I think it does damage women more, in that being the dominant male in Afghan society, and doing to women whatever you like is not healthy for your own psyche, but the woman can obviously suffer severe harm. So I think globally there's still a huge need for a women's rights movement, and I think I prefer actually the term women's rights movement to feminism, because feminism, what would the opposite be? Masculinism, which sounds terrible. So women's rights, men's rights. But unfortunately, historically, we just seem to be stuck with feminism. So I'm happy enough to identify myself as a feminist. So I will gladly identify myself as a humanist, as an equal rights activist, and as a women's rights activist and a men's rights activist. But that said, I think in both camps, women's rights activism and men's rights activism, I think there's a lot of nasty vitriol, and there's so many bigots in both of those movements. I mean, I've seen videos from the kind of extreme feminist position with people with completely unaccepting views that I consider bigoted, and the kind of talk and comments that have been posted there that were vile and that I felt offended by because they were just anti-male. But I've seen exactly the same thing go on in a lot of conversations when it either came to male activism, or even more, even when it was just about someone doing an honest job of refuting the arguments of one of these extremist feminists. A lot of people would just jump on board and make very bigoted kind of sexist comments against women in general, rather than just against that specific position, which I think is unjustified. And as always, I think we just need a lot more acceptance of each other's position, a lot more understanding. And yeah, we're both sides as a whole aren't doing a good enough job. I think most people on both sides are doing an excellent job, but it's always the small vocal minority that really fucks things up, that really manages to grab the microphone and just pretend like they're promoting the actual position. But yeah, that was my little bit. So as I said, I'm happy to consider myself an equal rights activist, but if someone asks me, am I a women's rights activist, am I a feminist, I will say yes. If someone asks me, am I a men's rights activist, I will say yes. I will qualify both of those statements because they're very easy to be misunderstood with all of the unsincere people out there, or the people that hold positions that I think are bigoted. But I would have to say I identify as both of them, rather than saying I identify as neither of them and I will only apply the centrist label. I apply the centrist label and both of the positions, which I think basically go hand in hand with that centrist label. And if we obviously achieve men's rights and women's rights, then we'll all be better off. So this wasn't in any way a disagreement. It was just my way, I guess, of justifying myself when I say that I am happy to call myself a feminist. Anyways, Church of STFU. I'll see you guys all later.